With the basics about routing set, let's enhance our application a bit by going back to the app module and adding some other routes to it. Let's say that besides our users route here, we also want to be able to load a single user, so to load the user component, which simply, gives us that single user. For that, we might want to load a user dynamically, because if we have a look at our users component, we see we get 3 users with different IDs. So it would be nice if we could pass the ID of the user we want to load in that route path. One approach would be to set up a route with user 1 and then one with user 2, and it doesn't look very optimal because it's not very dynamic, and still, how would we know inside of this component which route was loaded? Okay, we could parse the path manually, but that's not really a great approach. Instead, we can add parameters to our routes, dynamic segments in our paths. We do this by adding a colon and then any name you like for example ID. You will later be able to retrieve the parameter inside of the loaded component by that name you specify here, so by ID in this case. And the colon simply tells Angular that this is a dynamic part of the path. Without colon, only routes which are user/ID, and with ID I literally mean the word ID, would lead to this component. With a colon, user/anything else would load this component, and anything else would be interpreted as the ID. Now with this in place, we are able to load a component, the user component, with this dynamic piece sent to it. So if we have a look to this user component or at this user component, here we simply say user with ID, and now we simply have a dummy text here loaded and user name with some dummy text here. Now, for now, we won't touch this. We won't use this parameter. We will do this in the next lecture. Let's now see if we successfully reach this. So if we save this to let it recompile and we go back, we are in users. Let's add /something here. And you see the single user component was loaded. The same if we add /1 here. So this thing, the segment after /users, is indeed interpreted as dynamic. Otherwise, we would get the error that users/1 is an unknown route. It isn't, because we set it up to be a known one, because again, we added this dynamic path segment here. Now this is how we can dynamically load some route, how we can encode some data into our path. How can we get access to this data in the loaded component though? Because that, of course, is another key question. Let's take a closer look in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we created our route with a dynamic path segment. Now we want to get access to the data the user sent us, or which is encoded in the URL, I should say. So we know that we will load the user component, this one here, and we know that there will be some data in the URL for us. How can we get access to it? Well, it is in the TypeScript file where we can get access, and there we need to inject something we already injected before, the active route. So this is again on activated route, so make sure to use this type and import it from @AngularRouter. And by injecting this, we get access to the currently loaded route. Now I told you that this currently loaded route is a JavaScript object with a lot of metadata about this currently loaded route. One of these important pieces of information is the currently active user. Now you see that in this user component, I already defined a user object at the top, which is undefined for now. It should have the following structure, and it's not used right now. But we could load our user by simply, getting access or retrieving this parameter from our URL. So it would be nice if, let's say, in ng-on-init, when our component gets initialized, we get our user. So we maybe want to say this user equals, and now we assign it to a JavaScript object because that is the type of it, a JavaScript object with an ID and with a name. Now the value for the ID can be fetched from our route, and there we have a snapshot property, and on this snapshot of our currently active route, we have a params JavaScript object, and here we can get our ID. And now you will only have access to properties here, well, which you defined in your route parameters. So this part here, we named it ID here, so we can retrieve the ID from this params object here. Now the name is something which is not encoded in the route right now. So maybe we should do this too. Let's go to app module and let's simply add another dynamic part here, :name. Now we also will get this as a parameter, so we can retrieve it the same way we retrieve the ID. Let's retrieve the name. And it's in the same params object because this is all part of the route which was loaded due to this path we set up in app module being triggered, which holds two dynamic pieces. And you can add as many parameters here as you want. They will all be retrievable on this params object of the loaded route. With that, we assign something to our user. Now we could go to our HTML document and output that data. So with string interpolation, here we could output user ID. It will now be set, we know that. And username maybe. Both will be available because we set it in Ention init. Now this should work, so if we save this and we target /users1 max maybe, so that we have both the ID and the name, and we hit enter, we correctly see ID 1, name max. If we change the ID to 3, we see ID 3 here. So this seems to work, and you even see that this is still marked as active because this currently active path still contains /users, which was the route for this link. So this router link active directive is still doing its job. Now this seems to be working fine. Now let me add something to it which will break it though. I'll do this in the next lecture. In the last lecture we saw how we can retrieve our route parameters and it was working fine, but there are ways to break this. There are cases where this approach will not work, and I will show you a typical example. On our users component, we right now always saw that we have the user ID and name we passed on our URL. Now in here, let me quickly add a router link. So I'll add a horizontal line and then add an anchor tag where I remove the ref and instead say router link. And now I will actually use this syntax with the squared brackets where I pass an array. And I want to load /users, an absolute path to load the correct route. The second element will be the ID. So this might be, let's say 10, could be a number, could be a string. And then the name, let's say Anna. So this will now construct a route which is /users/10/Anna. And this is where this array approach might be better because you can really structure this really well, and we will soon see how you can even make this more dynamic. So here I will say load Anna, ID 10, something like that, any text you like. And now let's see this here. We got this link on our currently loaded page with users 3 max. And if I click this, you see that the URL was updated. Now it's users 10 Anna, but the text here wasn't. And this is not a bug. This is the default behavior. And what is happening here? Do you have an idea? The behavior here, as I just mentioned, is not a bug. We load our data by using this snapshot object on the route. Now, if we load a new route, what happens? Angular has a look at our app module, finds the fitting route here, hopefully, loads the component, initializes the component, and gives us the data by accessing the snapshot here. Now that only happens if we haven't been on this component before. But if we click this link, which is on the user component, well then the URL still changes, but we already are on the component which should get loaded. So Angular, cleverly, doesn't reinstantiate this component. That would only cost us performance. Why would it re-render a component we already are on? Now you might say, because the data we want to load changed. But Angular doesn't know. And it's good that by default it won't recreate the whole component and destroy the old one if we already are on that component. Still, of course, you want to get access to the updated data. And you can. It's fine to use the snapshot for the first initialization, but to be able to react to subsequent changes, we need a different approach. In our TypeScript code in ng-on-init here, let's say after we assigned this initial setup, we can use our route object, and instead of using the snapshot here, there is some params property on this route object itself. Now we didn't use that before, we had the snapshot in between. What's the difference? Params here is an observable. And now observables is something I will come to right after this section where we will take a closer look. Basically, observables are a feature added by some other third-party package, not by Angular, but heavily used by Angular, which allow you to easily work with asynchronous tasks. And this is an asynchronous task, because the parameters of your currently loaded route might change at some point in the future if the user clicks this link, but you don't know when, you don't know if, and you don't know how long it will take. So therefore, you can't block your code and wait for this to happen here, because it might never happen. So an observable is an easy way to subscribe to some event which might happen in the future, to then execute some code when it happens without having to wait for it now. And that is what params is. It is such an observable, and as the name implies, we can observe it, and we do so by subscribing to it. So you can call the subscribe method on it, and this is still called on params. I'm just bringing it in a new line to make it easier to read. And now subscribe can take three functions you pass here as arguments. Now, the first one is the most important one here. It will be fired whenever new data is sent through that observable. So to put it in easier words, whenever the parameters change in this use case. So then, this first argument, which should be a function here, is executed. I will use a ES6 arrow function, and here we will get the updated params as an argument, and you can set this of type params, doesn't really make a difference. It has to be imported from @AngularRouter then though. But anyways, params will always be an object, just like here on the snapshot, which holds the parameters you defined in the route as properties. So in the function body of this arrow function, so of this function which gets executed whenever the parameter changes, here we can now update our user object. And we can say this user ID should now be params ID, referring to the params we passed here. And the same, of course, for the name. Oops, with a semicolon at the end, of course. So this will now update our user object whenever the parameter change. That's why it's inside of this callback and of this anonymous function passed to the subscribe method here. This code will not be executed when ng-on-init runs through. This code here will, so the subscription will be set up, but only if the parameters then change. Only in this case, we will exchange them in our user object. That is why with this change in place, if we now go back to free and max, we see free and max is displayed here. But if I now click this link, it correctly updates here too, because our observable fires, and we then retrieve the updated parameters and assign them to our user object. And this therefore actually is the approach you should take to be really safe against changes not being reflected in your template. Now, if you know that the component you're on may never be reloaded from within that component, as we're doing it here, then you might not need this addition. You might simply use the snapshot, because if you know your component will 100% of the time be recreated when it is reached, because there's no other way of reaching it, there is no way of reaching it whilst being on that component. If you know that, you don't need to subscribe. In all other cases, make sure to use this approach to get informed about any changes in your route parameters.